Welcome to Minority Report. I'm your host, Salomón Flamenco. On today's episode, we have Ana Sofía Peláez, Executive Director and co-founder of Miami Freedom Project, a progressive organization working out of Miami, Florida. This is a really fun conversation to have. I wanted Miami Freedom Project on specifically because of Ron DeSantis. I mean, I don't know if there's any other way for me to really sugarcoat it, right? I think that Florida is facing some serious challenges right now, and it concerns me that he's probably going to run for president, and I wanted to see what it was like working in a progressive organization in not only a red state, but in the specific cultural context that is Miami, Florida. And I thought it was really cool to learn about. I thought it was really cool to hear about the motivations behind it, and again, some of the specific challenges that come about working in this specific cultural context. Here is our conversation with Ana Sofía, and I hope you all enjoy it. Hi, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Typically when I start this, I always ask everyone, who are you and what do you do? But based on your organization, I know there is a little feature called the Miami Freedom Stories. So I want to ask, who are you, what do you do, and what is your Miami Freedom story?
My name is Ana Sofía Peláez. I am the co-founder and executive director of Miami Freedom Project. And my Miami Freedom story began when my family made the difficult decision to come from Cuba. They came here in the early 60s. It was very much in response to the revolution, where they didn't feel that they could continue in Cuba in the way that it was changing. So they made the difficult decision to leave and to start a new life in the United States. For me, the imperative was always that they came seeking freedom in a ways that they no longer felt like they would have in Cuba, given the change in what happened as a result of the revolution. So my Miami Freedom story very much belongs as part of that process. And the reason that we decided to start our project and name it the Miami Freedom Project was because we felt that our families came here. That's what our families were seeking. And very much because they were seeking that freedom, it was that freedom for us is something that exists across the political ideological spectrum. And we wanted to create a space where we felt people could have that conversation across a lot of ideologies and a lot of ideas, because our family did not come here seeking to be single party, seeking to think only one way, thinking to follow a very hard line in any direction. They came here for freedom. And we wanted to make sure that people were finding ways to express that.
Yeah. What I love about the name also is just Miami Freedom Project, because it plays into that idea that everything we're doing is a work in progress, right? That's cool.
I agree with that. And I think that's very much, I think that if you ever get to the end of that project, you've probably gone too far, in the sense that if you're not constantly checking in with yourself, checking in with your community, and making sure that everybody feels that they're participating and that they're in some ways improving upon and evolving through in ways that are positive for everyone and getting the best possible outcome, you've probably gone too far. I don't know that certainty is a place where freedom is very comfortable. I think the kind of certainty we might feel in our own ideas or beliefs is probably where we may be kind of gone too far into an extreme.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the more concerning things for me right now in this current moment, is everyone's very much set in their ways with no room to dialogue with each other.
Absolutely. And I think people feeling that they're in some ways too easily identified, or that their ideas aren't complicated, or that they even have a full understanding, and they can't be kind of very aligned in one way on a certain issue, but then have a different experience or a different perspective on another. And I think to the extent that we're able to have that conversation, I think is really, it's essential. And to have that understanding and to give people a chance. I think, if you feel strongly about the way a person represents you, then you should absolutely support them. But if on a different issue at a different level, if you're looking at local versus state versus the governor's mansion versus the presidential, I think to the extent that you can have a different understanding, a different perspective at every level, I think is important. And I don't think we have that anymore. I think, it used to be you could identify a certain way and then have that be the start of, your understanding. And now it's kind of become the end. We don't really give people a way of even kind of expressing that complexity, and that, give them a sense that they can evolve in a way, or just have a different understanding of things in a way that they're not marked by it.
Yeah.
Or defined by it, really, is probably a better way of saying it.
Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the specific work Miami Freedom Project does in South Florida?
Sure. So Miami Freedom Project does the work of creating a political home for progressive Miamians. We focus on the Latino community, which is very diverse in Miami, and it comes with a diversity of experience, which in many ways can hinder or maybe impact ability of Latinos to become involved in progressive issues or become involved in issues from a progressive perspective. We're a majority minority city, which means that we have a majority of foreign-born residents, and many of the people who work with Miami Freedom Project have that first and second generation Latino experience, oftentimes coming from Latin America in circumstances we would describe as traumatic, fleeing an authoritarian regime. So many times that experience influences how they're able to understand and assimilate and advocate in a different political context. So if you think of someone coming from Colombia, being a first generation American, many times they're participating in US, they're participating in an election, but their vote, how they see the issues, how they understand them, is impacted by a political context that's developing and happening in Colombia. Mm-hmm. So you almost you're reacting to a situation in Colombia, but you're voting in the United States. So to the extent that we're able to understand that experience and really make sure that people are understanding issues in a very real time, real experience here, that's part of the work of Miami Freedom Project, having that innate understanding that we're understanding things differently, we're interpreting them differently because of this experience, this lived experience of our families.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. I think this is incredible. I was listening to another podcast you were on. I'm forgetting what it was called. And this was kind of what your episode was about. It was talking about how can you kind of bring those generational and ideological gaps, right, from family to family. Yeah.
And look, it's important if we want to see the progress that we would want to see in our community. So if you think about someone who is living in these very different political contexts at the same time, and they have an express need. They need their first generation Americans. They're coming from an immigrant background, and they're experiencing all the difficulties of that, what that assimilation looks like economically, culturally, in a kind of social way, in the way we feel that we have a kind of support system. All these things that we experience as Latinos who are having that experience of migration, immigration, all of those challenges. And, they have a very basic need of healthcare. They're engaging in a public school system that's very different from what they may have known before. The way that they advocate, the way that they make a connection between the people who are best representing the issues that impact them and the services that they need, the way they understand that is going to impact their vote. So we want to make sure that if they're going to be asked to make that decision, that they have all the information, that they have a full breadth of political diversity, different ideologies, different ideas, different opinions that are going to be able to inform that decision, and not have it be a reactive, trauma-informed response. Which, many politicians, for many different reasons, they can use that. It's something that it's a trigger that they can use, and they want to elicit that emotional response, and you don't want that emotional response to direct you in a way that is going to make you vote against your own interest. We have a community here, working class community in Hialeah, for example, that has a very high Obamacare enrollment. I think we might be highest in the country, but I would have to look into it to say we're always at the top. But I think we might be number one, but I'd want to look into that. But we have a very high Obamacare enrollment. And yet, if you were to look at how people vote, they would vote for people who and many times have voted against it, or have voted to repeal it, or have voted to minimize the impact it could have. We live in Florida's we haven't been able to close the Medicaid gap. We're in the process of trying to advocate for Medicaid expansion, even though we have a real express need for it. Mm-hmm. So these are always where the services that someone needs, and that have every reason as Americans to vote for and to hold their elected officials accountable for providing, they're not voting for. So how we can kind of understand that problem, so that there's a real cause and effect where you have an issue, you have a vote, you're able to make that vote count towards solving an issue that you're having.
I want to stay on this thread also. I'm just wondering, can you help situate myself as well as the audience as to what are some of the specific challenges facing Miami right now?
I'd say the one issue that people would probably identify first is housing. We've had an influx of population coming. That's always part of the Miami experience. This is something that we're moving population, and we have historic communities in Miami. We have Alapata, which is a historic Dominican community. We have Liberty City and Overtown, incredibly rich history of Black community, and they've always been inland. So the areas where maybe at one point were not considered desirable places to live, where people who were under-resourced would be able to find and create these communities, that's where they would concentrate. Because of climate pressures, you have people who would normally live on the coast. These were the kind of aspirational places we would want to think of living, moving inland, and places, these communities that were always had high rent populations. We're seeing a lot of turnover, and we're seeing the erasure of communities, are culturally distinct communities that we think of as having the reason that we love Miami, that you can have these experiences in different parts of our city. So this was something that was ongoing. And then at the same time, we've had an influx of people moving here since COVID. So we've had a really high population increase, and housing has become really inaccessible. So you have people at every stage in their life really finding that Miami isn't a place that they can be in a very fundamental way. You have people who are, you have climate gentrification due to climate pressures. You have people who are graduating and would want to come back to Miami and start their early professional careers here, who feel like it's not accessible. You have a community that provides all of our services that don't have the kind of immediate, transit doesn't really allow them to take these jobs that, people who we need, people who are our nurses, our teachers, aren't able to find housing that allows them to, continue to be part of our community. So you're seeing just displacement in every neighborhood, and you're seeing a migration north. And you're seeing a migration south, where people are being pushed into low-lying areas that are going to be more vulnerable to the sea level rise that we're seeing. So I'd say, those are the things that there's not a lot of things that I can walk into any family reunion, any friend group, any kind of community gathering and speak to, where everybody would have a concern with. Everybody would be in conversation of what those challenges are, and housing is one of them. It's something that's affecting everyone, because you can be very settled, but if your kids can't live here, if you're not going to see your grandkids because your family's going to have to move up north at one point, that's something that's very present for everyone. We also have a property insurance market that's falling apart around us. So our costs are driving up. Our high energy costs are really going up, and it's making life very unsustainable for many people here. And so I'd say that's probably the number one issue that we can all coalesce and agree that we need to see real action on.
Reading the Miami Freedom Project site, I noticed there were around 5 different sub areas that are the main focus, and housing was one of them. Housing, economics, racial justice, I believe it was Cuban freedom, and one other one that I am blanking on, and I apologize. I think it was voter engagement.
I think human rights and voter engagement. I do think, we do, I think, understand that any issue that you want to see movement on, the voter engagement piece is part of it. That's where you can actually, that's a report card. That's how well or badly we're doing. That's what kind of progress we want to see happening. I do think, I think as a group, as a organization that has a very welcoming Miamian identity. We recognize that we don't look like anyone else. We don't talk like anyone else. We don't operate like anywhere else in the United States. We're very unique, and I do think there's many pockets, like there's many kind of parts of the country that have a very kind of just where you see that there's a very distinct regional experience. And I feel like Miami is definitely one of those places that you think of as a kind of bridge where we're either northern Latin America or southern, where we go from being like the southern United States to northern Latin America. You feel like you have to go north to go south here, because Miami is such a unique kind of, there's so many strong diaspora communities that are all equally important and equally very much part of this culture in the city that's always remaking itself. So I do think we're very distinct in that piece. So I think where we kind of present this, it's really about social justice, and it's really about how you can have these conversations, and with those as priority issues, because I feel like we're always looking to identify areas that should be, they should be clear of any kind of partisanship or ideology. You should be able to have a place to live. You should be able to, have a career. Once you kind of set your path, you should be able to have a career that is able to support yourself, support your family, help you reach the goals that you have. So you're not only surviving in a community, but you're thriving in a community. So we want to make sure that economic justice is something that's accessible, and that's a kind of ongoing project that we're always expanding for our community, so they can continue to be part of what's adding to our community, what's contributing to our community. When you think about climate, we're experiencing a real existential threat. The reality of, we always have to think about, whereas we used to think about 50 years from now we're thinking about 40 years from now, 30 years from now, what Miami is going to look like. And certainly, every hurricane season, we have that real lived experience of feeling like we can be wiped off the map at any point. And then I think we've come to understand, and it's an essential part, that racial justice should inform any conversation we're having, because it has been just that kind of, it's in our DNA, and to kind of perpetuate systems of inequality. And to the extent that we're able to identify those and work through those, that we're able to see real progress and real equity, is something that we should have to make sure that is in a very intentional part of any work that you're doing in any progressive organization.
Mm-hmm. What I heard right now was essentially the variety of very important things Miami is facing right now, and the greater United States to a certain extent is facing right now, in terms of climate, housing, racial justice. But if you were to ask Governor DeSantis of Florida, he would categorize the biggest issue to be wokeism, as he calls it, right? Florida is where woke goes to die. And so I'm just wondering, how do you navigate that atmosphere in your work?
I recognize that wokeism is, well played, Governor DeSantis. It's something that, he gets to redefine every time he's at a lectern. And it's really, you can legislate it all day because nobody really knows what it is. It's something that we experience. It's something mutable. It's something that is really, he's trying to outlaw conversation, essentially. He's trying to outlaw a way of understanding your community. He's trying to outlaw a way of interpreting your history. And as we all know, that is something it's mutable, it's changing, it's something that evolves. So it's something that he can legislate all day, he can talk to all day, but nobody really, it means different things for different people. So as a politician, I would think it would be a really smart path to make your priority something that nobody can ever hold you accountable to, because it's not fixed. It's what you say it is, depending on what day it is. So I think, it's for us, I think it's really, as a progressive organization, it's challenging because you want to speak to the real harm that it's doing to people who are having the experience of being transgender youth in the godforsaken period of life known as middle school, and really making sure that they have the help, and they have the resources, and they have the understanding that they need to do to get through that experience, and to be able to continue to evolve and develop, and to have, feel that they have their full experience as human beings, that we would want that sense of safety for all children. And you would want children who are, yes, Black students, and you would want Latino students, and you would want white American students to understand their own history, because we understand that the United States is a project, and it's one that we always want to be looking towards perfecting. And I can't think of a better way than to have a truly critical, thoughtful understanding of what our history has been and how we've gotten here. So to the extent that he's able to legislate in a way that has a chilling effect on these conversations, on these experiences that are very unique and individual, and that we should all just be very present for and supportive of each other for, it has a chilling effect on our ability to engage on any of these issues in a thoughtful way. And at the same time, there's a very real, there's all the work that he's not doing. There's all the ways that he could be addressing the housing crisis, that he can be addressing our failing property insurance market. There's all the ways that he can be addressing climate change in a way that we're not just looking at resiliency, but sustainability, that there's a lot of things that we can be doing now and focusing our energies on now that it's going to ensure that Florida has a future. There's all the ways that he can be seeing people through this post-pandemic recovery. I think he's given a lot of attention, or he's made it one of the gains of his administration, that he opened Florida up early, but did that have to be at the cost of our teachers' peace of mind by challenging their ability to have masks in schools when they were still necessary, by our understanding of the vaccine and what it's truly allowed us to do, which is to get back to even imagine a world where things are going back to normal and things are opening up in a way that's safe. And I think those are the things that I think everybody would want to prioritize. I think Miami especially, there's a strong entrepreneurial spirit of people who are coming from other countries that want to be able to start their business. They want to be able to support their families. They want to be able to have these opportunities. That's why they risked they risked in a very real way their life, their well-being, their culture, their ability to be in a country that they loved and they felt seen and they felt a part of, and start a completely new life in another. How is he supporting our small businesses in that recovery? Those are the things that I think everybody would like to see, him prioritize, versus whether or not a child is bullied in school, and whether or not a teacher who is seeing that child be bullied has the language and the education and the understanding and the training to see to that child's safety, as well as their education. And to teach that kind of secular education that is also in many ways a kind of moral foundation for us, as an ethical foundation for us that should also be part of our learning. So I think when he kind of makes those his priorities, it's not just what he's doing that is creating more harm to people, it's also what he's not doing that could be to their greater benefit. So that's, I think that was a very long way to go a long way to the question.
It made sense though. It needed to get pulled out of there. So thank you for that. A little off script, but I'm wondering if you know anyone who is conservative in Miami, what has been the response to these culture wars of DeSantis on that end? Like, what has been the typical thought process?
I do think I think it can be very difficult, because I think there are people, I think with DeSantis, we always start at a very high level. He's 100% bad him against everything he's ever done. And I think when you have someone who's conservative, and there are people who are conservative who I respect, who I love, who I think, have a very important perspective to add. It's natural when you start at a very extreme to kind of be like, okay, well, it can't be all that bad. I think sometimes when we talk about, some of our worst instincts, I think that's a better instinct. You kind of look for something positive, you look for something good. And I think the danger in that is you kind of start explaining things away. So you can be like, okay, well, he hasn't done everything wrong. And it's like, sure, there may be some things he's done that you liked, and that's okay. But is it worth it if it's at the cost of a Florida student's well-being, if it's at the cost of somebody being seen safely through the pandemic? There's a trade-off to everything. So is whatever good you've seen in him, is that worth what was lost? You may not you may not be in favor of a kind of more open immigration policy. You may be, you may have concerns about immigration and what that would mean. Does that mean it's okay to go to another state and identify vulnerable people and move them under false premise to another state, like he did in Martha's Vineyard? Mm-hmm. Is it okay to have children part of that process? You may not, we may have a different viewpoint on immigrant justice, but is what those actions that were taken, are those ever okay? And is that a way that we can move forward in a positive way? To have this kind of political activism be part of real policies that our state is deploying. So those are the conversations that I think that are having with conservatives. And I do think I feel for conservatives who really are, guided by their own values, do have a sense of social justice, do have a sense of, what our government should do and how it should be behaving, because I don't feel like they're being represented well by the party or by this governor, where as he's governing in the kind of positions he's taken. I was raised by conservatives. I had a lot of respect for what they did, because for them, it was never a question of whether or not they should help someone who was vulnerable. It was just a question of who. Mm-hmm. So the government wasn't doing, it was something that they felt that they can do through their church, through their own activism, through their own work that they were doing as volunteers in the community. It was never a question of blaming the person who needed that help and vilifying that person and targeting them. It was always about who should help them. And if it shouldn't be the government, then that means it's my responsibility. And then they would take that very seriously. To have a kind of to kind of mark someone, any kind of government intervention, any kind of government help is wrong, but then to not also step into that vacuum that you've created, and to address that need of that person who needs you to be present or needs a service or needs support or needs a safety net, I think I don't think is what represents conservative Republican ideology well.
Mm-hmm. I feel like, especially in this current moment, because similarly, my parents, I feel like people forget, not to be too general, but immigrants can be pretty conservative, just based on their own respective histories, but it's completely lost the plot of what that means now.
It's like I don't take that away from anyone. I think, a lot of our conservative communities are also faith communities. Mm-hmm. And they may be socially conservative, but they also they have a social justice imperative that's part of their faith. And that's why I still consider myself very much part of a practicing Catholic, because I do not, I do feel that the social justice teachings of the church are something that I really value. And I don't think of myself as not being part of that community, because it sometimes finds a different expression from the more conservative elements that are also that are part of that community.
Yeah, of course. I want to reiterate once again and talk about Miami specifically. Mm-hmm. In light of what we just talked about, I don't want to play into the stereotypes that are common about, the Cuban conservative, the Venezuelan conservative, but I'm curious, what are some of the specific challenges of running and organizing in a progressive setting in Miami?
I think one of the challenges is that in wanting to represent that experience of coming from El Salvador and coming from Cuba and coming from Nicaragua and coming from Venezuela and coming from Chile and coming from Peru, like you want to honor the experience of your family. And no one wants to think that in taking a political position, in voting for a candidate and supporting a policy prescription and being for or against legislation that's being considered, nobody wants to think in any way that they're creating that separation from their family or in any way denying any part of that experience. And a lot of times when we come from countries where people have fled an authoritarian government, and that can take the form of a radical right, or it can take the form of a radical left. I don't know that I think life is very complex and there's a lot of gray area. So wherever you get into these extremes, I think you're going to have, there's going to be overreach, there's going to be real harm that can happen, because we just don't live that way. I think it goes against our nature to kind of be all one thing or all, just live in a very black and white world. I just don't think it works. So whenever that's imposed on any people, that's where you see a real harm. And I think people coming out of that harm, they need to be understood, and they need to be able to have that conversation. They need to be able to say, I was a Chavez supporter, and I thought that's who would help me. And things went really wrong, and I had this terrible experience because of it. Or I had to flee the revolution because I was no longer able to support my family, and I wasn't able to express myself, and I didn't feel like I was able to participate in my government in a way that I could feel whole, and that was the experience I wanted for my children. So I think people need to be able to have that conversation and be understood. And sometimes when things are uncomfortable, when we think about, if you don't want to think about having come from Cuba, having had that experience and having that real lived trauma not be understood by the people who you may agree with on an issue, but they don't really honor that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so many of us feel like we have to choose. We have to choose between being Cuban and caring about progressive issues, wanting to have access to healthcare, wanting to have education be accessible to you, wanting to feel that there are progressive movements where you can bring that experience to it and be seen and be understood, and still be able to see the actions that you want to take, see the actions that you want, happen. So I think, we never want to feel like we have to choose. One of the things that came up with Miami Freedom Project is that we would have people who would say, I'm Cuban American, but I care about reproductive justice. I'm Cuban American, but I'm a climate advocate. I'm Cuban American, but I care about immigrant justice. We wanted to say I'm Cuban American, because for many of us in the Cuban community, our experience as first and second generation immigrants is what informs our understanding of social justice. That vulnerability that our families experience is what makes us want to be there for our community, make sure that other people have access to the resources that were made available to our families. You always have these stories when you come over, or when your families comes over, and I don't know if you've had this experience where they say like, oh, this person got me a job. I was able to go to this agency and they were able to address this problem for me. I had, even for Cubans very early in the revolution, when they were coming in the early 60s, some of them didn't have their paperwork in place, and they were able to get to the point where they were in compliance. They were able to apply for, as things were made available to them, they were able to get their status adjusted, and they were able to continue as documented immigrants, and they were able to access resources because of that. Mm-hmm. So I think at every point in those stories, there's always someone who stepped in. There's always somebody who helped. There's always a law that was passed that said, these people need something. They're going to contribute. They're going to be a part of our community. Let's make this available to them. So that's who you want to be. That's the person that you want to be for someone else. You feel that imperative to be there. So I think there are many more people in the Cuban community that align in that way. But I don't think that we always feel comfortable being public about it. I don't think it's something that it feels very fractured. It feels that, you can't represent both in a very open way, because you don't want to be seen as not understanding the difficult history we had with what I think of as authoritarian regime, but that did identify as a leftist regime, that did identify as a progressive movement, even if in practice they were dictatorial. And in many ways, very much went against the freedoms that we value here. So I think, that's a very difficult conversation to have. So we have to be very open and vocal about happening so that other people feel seen, and other people feel like they can identify with these movements in a way that's safer, and in a way that they feel that they don't have to leave anything or anyone behind to participate.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple things to respond to that with. And number one, talking about, being open about this, what has been the reaction of people around you in this mission? I'm just curious.
I would say it's been very positive, and I think that's one of the things that we're always looking for. Like, I want people to say, and it has happened more often than not, I'm so happy you said it, or, you know, that they appreciate that there's a Cuban American group that is very critical of the human rights abuses that are happening in Cuba, because there are.
Mm-hmm.
The stories that come out of Cuba, the experiences that come out of Cuba are terrible. And we want the people who are coming out of those experiences to be heard. We want Cuba to get to the point where the freedoms that we take for granted here, that our families sacrifice so much to be able to have, are what our brothers and sisters can experience on the island. But we also want this community to be strong. We want this community to have as much as they need to continue and to thrive and to continue to evolve. And we want that healing to be there. We want to get to the point where it's not, because it doesn't become a right-left polemic. It becomes something that we have our full political diversity. We're able to express our ideas from the right and the left.
Mm-hmm.
We're able to have that conversation and not have it be toxic, and not have it to be something that you don't want to say, and have to kind of hedge what you're saying based on who you're talking with. So that's why we always, in our social media presence, in the op-eds we write, in the positions that we take on different issues that come up, and the way that we try to address them, we try to be very intentional about bringing both of those identities. I'm Cuban American, and I think this legislation that's outlawing certain books in schools is terrible, and this is not why. This doesn't represent the values that our families came, you know, that were important to our families. So many times people say, like, I'm so happy you said it, and it's a very kind of, like, you do always have that moment where you are going to take that public position where you kind of hold your breath a little bit, because you think, this matters to me, this is important to me. Does it matter to anybody else? And I think more often than not, we find people saying, yeah, thank you, because I feel that way too. And I didn't feel like I could say it. I didn't feel like I could express it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's who we're looking for. And that's where we want to not convince anyone, but to make people feel that there are other people who feel the way that they do, so they don't feel alone, so they feel like they can also have that presence in their community, and they can be more open about how they feel about things.
Yeah, of course. I think it's interesting, right? Because that is something that you have to, in my personal opinion, which I don't know if I should give, I do feel like a part of it is the way in which Anglo-American has, you know, weaponized this in a way, like weaponized the harm done in these countries for their own gain, where it becomes a bad word to say, you know, I like Bernie Sanders, or I think
Yeah.
this, or I have this opinion, you know, like it's very strange. Mm-hmm.
Look, and you can, you know, I can disagree with Bernie Sanders on Cuba,
Mm-hmm.
and I can agree with him on healthcare. And that's okay. And we can have that conversation and have that be the start of a conversation. And I think that's important, because I do think that is why our families came.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, when I think about my own family, there was political diversity, ideological diversity in my family, and that didn't change when we came here. And I think in many ways, it's a very neat part of the story. I think the Latino community, it's very diverse in and of itself. I think we're in many ways kind of seen from a kind of, I don't know if it's an Anglo or an American lens, as it can be hard to, you know, I think there are people almost reach for a simplicity. It's very, I think our community is just, will never be easily understood. And there's ways that we're very different in our accents, in our food, in our culture, things that we all know as Latinos. And then there are ways that we're very similar, because and I think the ways that we're similar is in the way that we're viewed. And no matter how different Cuban American is from a Mexican American, for some people, they don't see a difference in us. And in many ways, the way that we might be treated can be very similar, in the way that we're not, our kind of our full humanity is not easily understood. And, you know, I think there are points of commonality, and then there are very real, profound differences. And I think, you know, our experience is going to be very different for a lot of different reasons. So we're both like more similar than we want to be, and also very as different as we know ourselves to be. So, you know, I think we're always kind of navigating that duality as Latinos. Do I identify as a Latina? Yes. Do I identify as a Cuban American? It does get more and more granular. And I think we all had that experience. But yeah, I think if you were to kind of like pull back and look at us at a macro level, they'd be like, it's all Latino to me. So like, that's that's kind of it. That's where you can kind of look at the Venezuelan, you can look at the El Salvadoran, you can look at the Mexican American, kind of like, you know, look at it, we can look at each other and roll our eyes and say, there's a lot they don't see, and that's okay. We're, you know, it's you know, we all want to be understood, and it's and that's part of the work that we get to all do together, to kind of both be, you know, understood and seen more clearly, and then also to understand each other more deeply. Both as Latinos and as Americans. And you know, I think, you know, it's a project. It's all something it's ongoing and evolving. You know,
Yeah.
it's a privilege that we get to do this work, because a lot of sacrifices were made to get us to the point where, you know, I think if I were to explain to my like great grandmother who was experiencing the revolution, and be like, you know, abuela, you know, Appy, there is, you know,
Yeah.
they think I like hot sauce. She'd be like, "Are you kidding me? No, you kidding me?" Like, you know, you know, they think this. And she'd be like, Why are you? You're safe. You're fine.
Yeah.
You get to. You're good. Just, you know, go
I
forward."
feel that
So,
now, you know, it's funny talking to my parents sometimes, like, oh, this is what I'm doing today. And they're like, you complain over nothing.
see, I think that's a shared experience. I was yeah, I live in front of a public pool, and I do laps a lot. And on the weekends, there's always family day. And I was next to this family. They're very sweet, and I could tell from the way that they were speaking that they had come more recently, because they just didn't have. I think in Miami there's a patois where you can kind of tell how recently people have come, because, you know, if you have like a young child, but they're not dipping into English a lot, you know, like, okay, they're growing up in a house where Spanish language is dominant. Whereas opposed to, if, you know, for me, it's like, it's always kitchen Spanish. It's always a mishmash
Yeah.
of Spanish and English. But oh my God, this child speaks better than I do. So they must, you must be, you know, they must have come more recently. And, you know, the little girl, she was like maybe 6 years old, and she was talking to her dad, and she's like, okay, Dad, I'm going to go down halfway down here, and then I'm going to turn around, and then and then I'm going to go back to you. And I thought, you know, I'm kind of like doing my own kind of, you know, exercise, but I'm like aware of them. I'm like, oh, sweet. She's learning how to swim, and she wants to show her dad how much she's learned. And I, you know, I kind of go and come back, and then I kind of see, and then she says to her dad, she's like, okay, now I want you to try it. And, you know, he kind of like, he tries to do what she just did. And I realized, oh, she's not showing her dad how she learned to swim. She's teaching her dad how to swim.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's it. That's the experience every first generation, second generation kid knows. In some way, even though you love your parents, you feel safe with your parents, you're the bridge. You're the person who's translating these new experiences to them. And I think it's such a responsibility. And I think it maybe in many ways it's a formative responsibility. And I think so many of us share that. And that's something that cuts across ethnicity and race and background, if you're having that immigrant experience, and we're all in kind of different stages of it. But to me, that's such a unifying experience, that as first and second generation, we know what it is to have to turn to your parents and say, no, this is what she meant. And no, mom, you've got to, like, this is where this is. Like, we have to be the translators for our parents. And at the same time, I don't want to infantilize what our parents have done, because they're heroes. Also, they're people who have said, you know, this is not the life I want. I'm going to take this risk, and I'm going to go to a new country. And it was for us, and it was for these, you know, in many ways, sometimes it was for these families that they didn't even have yet, or for this future that they didn't even know yet, but they just knew that they were going to make this very serious life, in some ways life risking choice, to just look for something else in the world, and to create something else. And I think that we have this relationship with our families is something that connects all you know, all immigrants. And I think whatever other forms, whatever expressions it takes, that's that kind of core sense of, you know, kind of taking care of each other in ways that maybe flip the script. You can be like a young person taking care of your parents, and they've already done so much for you, more than I think anybody could have ever asked them as parents. I think that's a really unique and wonderful experience that's made us all who we are. And I think that's something that we can always communicate across. For me, that was my understanding of just kind of seeing that. I just something like I looked on and you're like, oh, that's it. That's exactly it. And I experienced that in so many different ways still. My mother's been here since she was 13, and I still have those moments where I'm like, Mom, no, this is it's okay. And she has those experiences where she looks at me and she'd be like, no, Ana, no se dice así. And she corrects my Spanish and she says, this is.
Yeah. I have some
Yes.
stories I'm thinking about that I can tell you after the call. But yeah, there's definitely those moments where it's funny to have to kind of like correct things, but also be corrected in turn. It's always that back and forth between. Yeah.
And I just feel like an awful person because I feel like, we'll laugh like, the accents and we'll joke. And it's always this thing. And I'm like, you know what? Their Spanish is better than my English. And I'm getting away with murder right now because, it's always like they speak two languages and you're like, ugh. And I'm giving them a hard time because my Maybelline has become my Beine.
Oh my God. But it's a problem though, because I know I've definitely been caught where sometimes I'll do my dad's voice, but in public, everyone's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, no, I love him. Like it's endearment.
Like it's like, but it's also like, I don't know, it's its own language. I think, the way, because it's like they find grooves in the English language that you just kind of, blitz through. They're like, oh God, I guess it's spelled that way. And why wouldn't we think this way? Or like the emphasis is all, like, that's kind of great. Like, it's like, it's its own patois that, only we can really understand.
It's a really cool thing that's happening, like still ongoing because the population keeps growing with just certain grooves of rhythm and linguistics are happening. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's really cool to hear them.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, I'm sorry if this is coming off the little thing.
it was, but it's okay. I was gonna make a note of it afterwards, but
I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to mute it without muting myself.
I guess just to kind of, slowly close out, I'm wondering, how do I phrase this? Do you take issue with how Miami is typically like portrayed in popular culture, or just, in the general atmosphere of the rest of the country? And what is your vision of Miami?
Yeah, I do take issue because I think Miami is a city that, because it's a largely majority foreign born city, because it's a largely Latino city in the way that it's identified, even though I do think we have also, of course, very large diaspora communities from Haiti and from other parts of the world that have been equally important and formative in Miami. I think to the extent that Miami can be easily dismissed, it is in some ways a kind of anti-immigrant bias and a discomfort that we can have a city that's very comfortable, that's entirely established by people who are comfortable in being outside of an American cultural context. And that could be that can be something that, and when you dismiss kind of Miami, you're dismissing a city that's very much a city of the future, because in our global the global direction everything's going with, we're experiencing things in real time that other people are going to eventually catch up to. And I think in some ways it's like it's that discomfort. I know someone who, he said, he was going to he was going to Colombia very often, and he kept getting pulled aside by the customs person. And he got really frustrated, and he said, I come here very often. I'm just, I have this reason for coming here. There's nothing nefarious going on. You stop me and you question me every time. Why do you keep stopping me? I never have anything. Why do I always concern you? And he said, because there's something about you I can't explain. And that's all we're looking for. That's my job. I'm supposed to identify people I can't explain and then pull them aside. And I think Miami is very much that city. There's something about us they can't explain. And for that reason, we're always kind of a point of, derision, or, and at the same time, we're kind of exoticized in a way that they're just like, oh, it's so, that's where you can go there and kind of almost like a free state where you can kind of do things that you can't do in other places. There's something about us that people can't easily explain. And I think that's what makes us, something that people are both fascinated by, but then they also want to diminish or contextualize, or just say like, oh, they're just crazy. And you're like, oh, yeah, maybe, but we're also very much, very much part of the United States. We're very much part of this country. You're going to find probably the most patriotic people in the world here, because they do value democracy, and they do have such a lived experience of they've experienced the loss of it, and that finds expression in a lot of different ways. Some of them I think are positive. Some of them I think can, maybe not be expressed, be positive in a way that I would like, or can maybe feel like they're self-defeating. I don't know. That person probably has a different perspective on it, but I think, I think there's a lot of things that if you can resolve them here, you'll find a model that can be followed, if we replicated across the United States. Because to have a largely immigrant community that has achieved this degree of political and cultural weight, I think is really important, and I think it's wonderful, and I want it to be seen as a positive, and I want it to be seen as a positive for others who maybe don't have the same resources, don't have that same political power. I want us to be seen as all going towards a positive direction in a way that we extend it to other communities. So that's what I would like to see happen in Miami. Not have it be something of like, oh, there's all these, fractured people who have become, kind of associated with anti-authoritarian, anti-democratic institutions, or have become part of this very ideologically hard right state. I want us to stay, what we've always been. We've always been a swing state. We've always been a community that, beyond being, right or left, Republican or Democrat, has always been a community that is always engaged in this process. Has always kind of been in the process of understanding it, because, we're a very large persuasion. We're persuasion voters, and I think every community, white, Black, Latino, they should always feel, every elected official should feel that your vote is in play, and they should always be working very hard to keep your vote. They should never be able to just kind of like sit back and be like, oh, I know what to say to them. I can figure them out. I can just tell them what they want to hear and just kind of, keep going my way. No, you should always be communicating with people, and you should always be held accountable for providing and kind of seeing through whatever you've promised, in a way that honors the sacrifice they made in reaching this state of safety and democracy. So, yeah.
That's a really good answer. Yeah, that was awesome. That was incredible. Thank you for that. Even me, I'm still like absorbing what was said.
I'm a rambler. So
no, you're an explainer, and I love it.
I'm Cuban, so this would also be, normally we could have this conversation. This should help you understand why there's always a crowd of people in front of Versailles drinking coffee and just like expounding. This is what we talking.
Oh, that's, an amazing cultural exchange right there. Where can the people find you, and where can they find Miami Freedom Project?
They can find us at Miami Freedom Project on Instagram, and at Miami_freedom on Twitter. And we're always, we're always engaging. We're always trying to hear from other people in the community, and really wanting to share our platform so that everybody can feel heard and seen, and just be part of the conversation that we've started.
Thank you for joining me. This has been incredible.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
What does freedom mean to you? Because to me, freedom does not mean punishing kids for trying to figure out who they are, right? It does not mean suppressing the right to vote. Actually, if I think about it, suppressing the right to vote sounds like the complete opposite of freedom. If I'm being honest, it this this new language of the right, against anti-wokeness and critical race theory, it's all the same old dog whistles, right? They're packaged it for a new audience or for a new modern era, but it's the same nonsense. And at the end of the day, listen, there are some real problems facing Florida, and there are some real issues facing Miami, whether it's climate change, whether it's racial justice and equity, whether it's housing affordability or accessibility, right? These are real and these are ever present. We don't need to make up bad guys to fight. Like we have plenty at our disposal. We have plenty of issues that need to be addressed. To make up new ones for the sake of pandering to this audience that just wants politics to be a gladiator fight. I mean, it's ridiculous and it's cruel. And it's not what freedom means to me. Respectfully. This has been Minority Report. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you next time. This has been Minority Report with me, your host, Salomón Flamenco. The socials to Minority Report will be in the description down below alongside the socials for Miami Freedom Project. If you would like to continue the conversation, email us at minorityreport.beat@gmail.com. We'll see you next week.